Hey there. Tonight, we're pushing past those swinging doors. You know the ones. The iconic batwing doors of the Wild West Saloon. A place that exists in our collective imagination as a stage for high drama. It's a world of handsome, stoic strangers, witty bartenders who are always polishing a glass, jaunty piano players who never seem to hit a wrong note, and heroic gunfights that erupt in a blaze of glory. Almost every single part of that image is a myth. The historical frontier saloon was rarely a stage for heroism. It was the messy, grimy, and often dangerous nerve center of a new and struggling society. It was a place of business, of politics, of desperate escapism, and of profound loneliness. It was a social hub, fueled by cheap, raw alcohol, and governed by a code of conduct that was often brutal and unforgiving. The reality of visiting a saloon was not a cinematic adventure. It was a full-body sensory assault. Tonight, we're going to step inside a real frontier saloon. We will breathe its air, drink its whiskey, meet its patrons, and understand its true role in the American West. We will separate the fiction from the often sordid facts. If this kind of slow, immersive, and myth-busting history helps you find a place of rest, I would be grateful if you'd like the video and subscribe. It is your support that makes these long, detailed explorations possible. And as always, I'm curious to see where our story is reaching. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now, let the world outside fade away. Dim the lights. Let your own comfortable space be a refuge as we prepare to enter a world that was anything but. The air is thick with smoke, the floor is covered in sawdust, and the man next to you has not bathed in a month. Let's go inside. The approach and the facade. Before you even enter, you must first find the saloon. You are walking down the main street of a frontier town in the 1870s. The street, as we have discussed in the past, is not a clean, tidy place. It is a wide, rutted track of dirt, which is either a choking cloud of dust or a thick, sucking morass of mud, depending on the weather. The air already carries the bass notes of the frontier: horse manure, wood smoke, and dust. You see the saloon from a distance. It is not necessarily the grandest building in town, but it is often the busiest. Its identity is announced by a crude, hand-painted sign. It might simply say, Saloon. Or it might have a more evocative name like the Eureka, the Alhambra, or the more direct Bucket of Blood. The sign is weathered, the paint peeling, a testament to the harsh sun and harsher climate. The building itself is likely a simple, rectangular, false front structure made of rough-sawn lumber. The iconic false front, a tall, flat facade that rises above the actual roofline of the building, is a piece of frontier boosterism. It's an attempt to make a simple, one-story clapboard shack look like a more substantial, two-story brick establishment from the east. It is an architecture of pure bluff, designed to impress newcomers and project an image of prosperity that may or may not be real. The wood is unpainted, weathered to a silvery grey, and dotted with knot holes and splinters. Now, about those famous swinging batwing doors, while they did exist, they were not universal. Many, if not most, saloons had a regular, solid wooden door. The swinging doors were more common in the warmer climates of the southwest, as they allowed for better air circulation, a crucial feature in a crowded, smoky room in the desert heat. But they offered no protection from the dust, the flies, or the cold. In the colder climates of the northern plains or the mountains, a solid door that could be shut tight against a blizzard was a matter of survival. So, let's assume you've found a saloon with a regular door. As you approach, the sounds from within leak out into the street. It is not the sound of a jaunty, well-played piano melody. That is a Hollywood invention. While some of the grander establishments in larger cities like San Francisco or Denver might have had a piano, the average frontier saloon did not. The sound you hear is a cacophony. It is the sound of loud, boisterous, often drunken male voices, a mixture of laughter, shouting, and arguments. It is the scraping of chairs, the clink of glasses, and perhaps the sound of a lone, untuned fiddle sawing away at a folk tune in the corner. The sound is not inviting. It is a wall of raw, chaotic human noise. You stand before the door. You are a stranger in this town. You know that entering a saloon is a social act, a statement. It is the primary place of public life for men on the frontier, but it is also a place with its own complex, unwritten rules and potential dangers. Every man inside will turn to look at you when you enter. They will assess you in an instant. Your clothes, your demeanor, whether you look like a victim or a threat. Your first few moments inside will set the tone for your entire visit. You take a breath, smelling the already thick air that leaks from the door frame. You put your hand on the rough, wooden door, turn the iron latch and push it open. The wall of sound hits you, and with it, the even more powerful wall of smell. You have just stepped into the real Old West saloon. The first impression, a sensory assault. The moment you step across the threshold and the door closes behind you, your senses are overwhelmed. The experience is not cinematic. It is visceral, a physical assault on your nose, your ears, and your eyes. This is the reality that the movies, with their clean sets and filtered soundtracks, can never capture. First, and most powerfully, there is the smell. It is a thick, complex, and deeply unpleasant miasma that has been fermenting within these four walls for years. It is a smell you can almost taste. Let's dissect its layers. The dominant note is stale beer and cheap, raw whiskey. The floor and the bar are soaked in it. Every time someone spills a drink, which is constantly, it adds another layer to the alcoholic perfume of the room. Mixed with this is the acrid, heavy smell of tobacco smoke. The air is a thick, blue-grey haze from dozens of cheap cigars and pipes. The smoke stings your eyes and catches in the back of your throat. Beneath these two powerful odours is the rich, organic smell of unwashed humanity. This is a room full of men, cowboys off the trail, dusty prospectors, sweaty labourers who have not bathed in weeks. It is the smell of old sweat, of grimy wool and leather, of bodies that have been working hard and living rough. It is a smell that is both sour and animalistic, and there are other notes in this symphony of stench. The smell of the kerosene that fuels the few, smoky lamps that light the room. The faint, rancid smell of the free lunch sitting on the end of the bar. The smell of the sawdust on the floor, which is there to absorb spilled liquor, tobacco spit, and vomit, and which is only shoveled out and replaced when it becomes a truly sodden, foul-smelling mess. And underneath it all is the smell of the building itself, of damp, rotting wood and the ever-present dust. You take a breath, and you feel as if you are drinking the air rather than breathing it. Next, there is the sound. The room is a cavern of noise. There is no jaunty piano player providing a soundtrack. There is the loud, echoing roar of dozens of male voices, amplified by the bare wooden walls. The conversations are not witty banter. They are loud, often slurred, and punctuated by sudden shouts of laughter or angry curses. There is the constant scraping of heavy boots on the wooden floor, the thud of a heavy glass mug being slammed down on the bar, the click of poker chips, the rattle of dice. In one corner, a man with a fiddle might be sawing away at a high-energy but out-of-tune reel, adding a thin, frantic layer of melody to the general chaos. The noise is not cheerful. It is aggressive, a raw and unfiltered expression of the tension, boredom, and boisterous energy of the frontier. Finally, there is what you see. Your eyes take a moment to adjust from the bright sunlight outside to the deep, perpetual gloom of the saloon's interior. The room is lit by a few kerosene lamps, which hang from the ceiling or sit on the bar. They give off a flickering, yellow, smoky light that casts long, dancing shadows. The air is so thick with smoke that the light struggles to penetrate it, creating hazy beams that illuminate the dust motes and smoke rings floating in the air. The room itself is crude. The walls are unpainted, rough-sawn planks, perhaps decorated with a few faded newspaper clippings, a wanted poster, or the advertisement for a brand of whiskey or cigars, featuring a buxom, idealized woman. The floor is rough wood, or even just packed earth, littered with spent matches, cigar butts, and other detritus. The furniture is simple and utilitarian. A few heavy, square tables and sturdy wooden chairs or benches built to withstand the occasional brawl. You see the men. They are not the square-jawed heroes of the screen. They are rough-looking men. Their faces are weathered by the sun and wind. Their clothes are dirty and worn. They are drinking, gambling, talking, and staring. And now they are staring at you. Every eye in the room has registered your entrance. They are sizing you up, their gazes ranging from idle curiosity to suspicion to a predatory assessment. You are the new element, the unknown variable in this closed and often dangerous social ecosystem. This is your first impression. It is not one of adventure or romance. It is a feeling of being overwhelmed, of stepping into a place that is loud, dirty, smelly, and latently hostile. Your modern sensibilities are screaming at you to turn around and leave. But you are here to experience the real West. So you push your way through the crowd towards the grimy altar at the heart of this establishment. The bar. The bar, the altar of an unholy church. The bar is the focal point of the saloon. It is the social, economic, and spiritual center of this male-dominated world. But you must banish the Hollywood image of a long, polished mahogany bar with a gleaming brass footrail and a massive, ornate mirror behind it, reflecting the entire room. The bar in the average frontier saloon was a much cruder and more practical affair. In the earliest or most primitive saloons, the bar might be nothing more than a single, long, thick plank of wood laid across two upright barrels. It was a simple, functional surface for serving drinks, and it could be easily dismantled or replaced. In a more established town, the bar would be a more permanent structure, built of heavy wood, its front often scarred and dented from years of being kicked by heavy boots and hit with chairs during fights. The surface of the bar is not polished and gleaming. It is a dark, sticky, grimy surface, perpetually wet with spilled liquor. It is rarely wiped down, and when it is with a sour-smelling rag that only moves the grime around. There is probably no brass footrail. That was a feature of fancier city saloons. Here, you simply rest your boot on the floor. Behind the bar, there might be a mirror, but it is unlikely to be the huge, ornate, crystal-clear mirror of the movies. A large mirror was an incredibly expensive and difficult item to transport to the frontier. If there is a mirror, it is likely to be small, of poor quality, its silver backing flaking, its surface cloudy and distorted. Its primary purpose was not decoration, but security. It allowed the bartender to keep an eye on the room, to watch for trouble, without having to turn his back on the customers he was serving. More common than a large mirror was a simple set of wooden shelves behind the bar. This is where the saloon's meager stock was displayed. A few dusty, unlabeled bottles of whiskey, a keg of beer on a stand, a box of cheap cigars, and a motley collection of thick, heavy glass tumblers. The glassware was not delicate. It was made to be durable, to survive being slammed on the bar and used in the occasional fight. It was cleaned by being quickly dipped in a bucket of murky, cold water behind the bar, a bacterial soup that was rarely changed, and then wiped with the same multi-purpose dirty rag. The man behind the bar, the saloon keeper or bartender, is the master of this domain. He is not the witty, philosophical confidant of the movies. He is a businessman, and often a very tough one. His job is to sell as much alcohol as possible while preventing the place from being torn apart by his drunken patrons. He is often armed, keeping a sawed-off shotgun or a pistol under the bar for self-protection. He is the informal banker, the referee of disputes, and the enforcer of the saloon's unwritten rules. He has seen it all, and he is not easily impressed or intimidated. At the end of the bar, you might see the famous free lunch. This was not an act of generosity. It was a clever business tactic. The free lunch consisted of a spread of intensely salty foods: crackers, pretzels, salted fish like herring or sardines, pickles, and perhaps a bowl of salty boiled eggs. The food was free, but its purpose was to make you incredibly thirsty. The saltier the food, the more you would drink. The more you drank, the more money the saloon keeper made. It was one of an early and very effective marketing strategies. You belly up to the bar. The bartender gives you a non-committal nod. He is not your friend. He is here to sell you a drink. The smell of stale beer and spilled whiskey is strongest here. You put your hands on the sticky, grimy surface of the bar. It is the altar of this secular church, and you are here to take communion. The only question is, what's your poison? The drink, what's your poison? Literally. You have made it to the bar. The bartender gives you a look that says, what'll it be? You do not have a menu of craft cocktails to choose from. Your options are brutally simple. Essentially, you can have whiskey or you can have beer. And both are likely to be of a quality that would be considered undrinkable, if not hazardous, today. Let's start with the king of frontier drinks, whiskey. When you order a shot of whiskey, you are not getting a carefully aged bourbon or a smooth Tennessee sour mash. You are getting rot gut. The whiskey served in the average saloon was a raw, unaged, and often adulterated spirit. The process began with a barrel of cheap, high-proof, neutral-grain alcohol, shipped in from a distillery back east. This raw alcohol was harsh, colourless, and had little flavour of its own. It was the saloon keeper's job to turn this into whiskey. He would do this by mixing the alcohol with water, of questionable purity, and then adding other ingredients to give it colour and a semblance of flavour. Burnt sugar or molasses would be added for a brownish, whiskey-like colour. A little chewing tobacco might be thrown in to give it an amber tint and a smoky, aged flavour. But often, the adulterations were more sinister. To give the whiskey more kick, and to make the drinker feel its effects more quickly, saloon keepers would add a host of other substances. A little chili pepper or strychnine, a poison, in tiny amounts, could create a burning sensation that mimicked the warmth of good whiskey. Turpentine could add a piney note. Ammonia could give it a sharp bite. The result was a chemical concoction, a witch's brew designed to get you drunk as quickly and as cheaply as possible. This is why it earned its many nicknames: tarantula juice, coffin varnish, bust head, red eye. You order a shot. The bartender takes one of the thick, cloudy glasses, sloshes it in the bucket of murky water behind the bar, and places it in front of you. He then pours a measure of the reddish-brown liquid from an unlabeled bottle. The standard price for a shot of whiskey was 2 bits or 25 cents. You slide your money across the bar. You pick up the glass. The smell is sharp and chemical, with a hint of sweetness, and something else you can't quite identify. You toss it back. The liquid hits your tongue, and the back of your throat like a flame. It is raw, burning, and harsh. It has none of the complex, oaky flavours of a modern whiskey. It is simply a vehicle for alcohol, a blunt instrument of intoxication. You feel a wave of heat spread through your chest. The effects are rapid. The cheap alcohol hits your system hard, and after just 1 or 2 of these drinks, the world can start to seem a little blurry at the edges. What if you're not in the mood for hard liquor? Your other option is beer. But again, you must forget everything you know about modern beer. There is no refrigeration. The beer is not served cold and crisp. It is served at room temperature, which in a hot frontier saloon means it is warm. The beer was not bottled or canned. It was shipped to the saloon in large wooden barrels from breweries in cities like St. Louis or Milwaukee. The journey was long and hot. By the time the barrel arrived at the saloon, the beer inside was often flat, and sometimes it had started to turn sour from bacterial contamination. The bartender will draw you a mug of beer from a spigot hammered into the side of the barrel. The mug is heavy, made of thick glass or pottery. The beer is a dark, murky brown. It has little to no carbonation. You take a sip. It is warm, yeasty, and has a slightly sour, cidery taste. It is a far cry from the cold, refreshing beverage you might be hoping for. But, like the whiskey, it contains alcohol, and it is generally safer to drink than the local water, as the brewing process killed most of the bacteria. For many, Drinking beer was not a matter of taste, but of public health. There were no fancy cocktails. A bartender would not be mixing you anything. The fanciest drink you might get would be adding a little water to your whiskey. The idea of ice was an almost unimaginable luxury, something found only in the most opulent hotels in the biggest cities, where it was harvested from frozen lakes in the winter and stored in insulated ice houses. So you stand at the bar, with your warm, flat beer or your shot of chemical-laced rotgut. This is the fuel of the frontier. It is the social lubricant, the painkiller, the source of courage, and the cause of countless fights, tragedies, and lost fortunes. It is not a drink to be savoured. It is a drink to be consumed, a tool to be used to escape the harsh, monotonous, and often brutal reality of your daily life. The patrons, a who's who of the frontier. You are standing at the bar, the harsh whiskey still burning a trail down your throat, a fire that does little to combat the chill of social observation. You take a moment to truly see the room, to understand the complex, volatile ecosystem of which you are now a part. The saloon was the great social leveller of the West, a place where different classes and occupations were forced to mix in a way they rarely did elsewhere. But it was not a harmonious melting pot. It was a collection of tribes, each defined by its labour, its origins, and its desires, each with its own customs, grievances, and potential for violent conflict. Let's look closer at who you are sharing this smoky, grimy room with. In one corner, making the most noise, is a group of cowboys. They are young, some of them little more than boys. Their faces a strange mix of teenage awkwardness and sun-weathered toughness. They are fresh off a 3-month cattle drive from Texas, a journey of mind-numbing boredom, constant labour, and forced sobriety. They have just been paid, and the wad of cash in their pockets is a temporary, burning thing, an alien object in a life of wage slavery. Now, freed from the discipline of the trail boss, they are exploding with a volatile mix of relief and aggression. They are drinking fast, gulping down the cheap whiskey as if it were water, their laughter too loud, their jokes too crude. They slam their heavy glass mugs on the table, the sound punctuating their boisterous talk. Their bodies, accustomed to the open range, seem too large and clumsy for this confined space. They swagger, but it is the swagger of exhaustion trying to pass for confidence. They are a whirlwind of chaotic energy, a welcome source of quick revenue for the saloon keeper, but also a constant source of potential trouble. Their boisterousness can easily tip over into belligerence. An accidental bump, a perceived slight, a dispute over a woman, any small spark can ignite the dry tinder of their pent-up frustration and youthful arrogance. They are a temporary, dangerous storm that has blown into town. Hunched over the bar, alone, staring into the bottom of his glass, is a prospector. He is older, perhaps in his 50s, though he looks 70. His face is a leathery mask of desert sun, wind, and profound disappointment. His clothes are a patchwork of dust and repairs, the knees of his canvas trousers worn thin. He nurses a single, cheap whiskey, making it last, because it may be his last for a while. He has just come back from the hills after weeks of fruitless searching. His dreams of striking a mother-lode once again turned to dust and blisters. He is here not for celebration, but for solace, a brief, alcoholic escape from the crushing loneliness and the bitter taste of failure. He speaks to no one, and no one speaks to him. His silence is a heavy, impenetrable wall. He is a ghost at the feast, a living embodiment of the broken dreams upon which the West was built. At a table near the back, away from the chaos of the cowboys, a quiet game of cards is in session. Here sits the professional gambler. He is perhaps the only man in the room who looks like he belongs in a movie. He is well dressed, or at least better dressed than anyone else. He wears a clean, if slightly frayed shirt, a dark vest that conceals whatever secrets he carries, and perhaps a tie. His hands, resting on the table, are clean and still. His movements are economical and precise as he deals the cards. He does not drink to excess, perhaps only a single glass of whiskey that he barely touches. His eyes are his most important feature, They are cold, observant, and constantly moving, observing the other players, reading the slightest twitch of a muscle, the faintest flicker of an eye, looking for a tell, a sign of weakness or a bluff. He is a predator in a quiet suit, a social psychologist making his living off the foolishness, greed, and bad luck of others. His table is an island of tense, almost religious silence in the loud chaos of the room. The air around it is thick with suspicion, and it is a place where violence can erupt with shocking speed over a single, disputed card. A group of uniformed soldiers from a nearby fort might enter, their blue wool uniforms looking out of place amidst the civilian grime. They are often on a short leave, and like the cowboys, they are looking for a release from the monotony and strict, hierarchical discipline of military life. There is often a palpable tension between the soldiers and the civilians. The cowboys and miners might see them as lazy government employees, dandies who live off the taxpayer. The soldiers, in turn, might look down on the civilians as an unruly, lawless mob. This mutual contempt can easily lead to brawls, a clash of two different, rigid codes of masculinity. Sitting quietly by himself in a dark corner, trying to be invisible, is the homesteader. He has made the long, rare journey into town for supplies like salt, flour, and perhaps a new axe handle. He is a farmer, a family man, his hands thick with calluses from the plough, and he is profoundly out of his element here. The noise, the latent violence, the raw, transient masculinity of the saloon makes him deeply uncomfortable. He is here for one reason: to have a single warm beer, to feel a brief connection to the world of men before he loads his wagon and begins the long, lonely journey back to his isolated sod house, his wife, his children, and the crushing responsibilities of his life. He nurses his drink slowly, says nothing, avoids eye contact, and leaves as soon as his glass is empty. He is a visitor from another, more settled world. And then there is the drifter. He is the unknown quantity, the human coyote. He might be a failed prospector, an out-of-work labourer from the railroad, or an outlaw on the run, trying to lay low. He is quiet, watchful, and his eyes have a hard, desperate edge that the other patrons lack. He nurses a beer, not a whiskey, to make his money last and to keep his wits about him. He is the most dangerous man in the room, because he has nothing to lose and everything to gain. He is watching for an opportunity, a drunken cowboy with a fat wallet to be followed into a dark alley, a card game he might be able to cheat, a moment of weakness to exploit. He is the human predator, and the saloon, with its flow of money and alcohol, is his hunting ground. You are surrounded by these men, a volatile chemical mixture waiting for a spark. You learn the unspoken social code of the saloon quickly, out of a primal need for self-preservation. You learn not to stare at another man's cards. You learn not to speak to a man who clearly wants to be left alone. You learn to give a wide berth to the loud, drunken group in the corner. You learn that a sudden silence in the room is often more dangerous than the noise, as it means everyone has stopped to watch something that is about to happen. And you learn that in this place, your best defense is to be quiet, to be observant, and to be ready for anything. The games of chance, a fool's errand. The frontier was a world built on gambles. Men gambled their lives on the perilous journey west. They gambled their fortunes on a hole in the ground that might or might not contain gold. They gambled their futures on a patch of dry land that might or might not receive rain. It is no surprise then that the saloon, the crucible of this world, was dominated by games of chance. Gambling was not just a pastime, it was an obsession, a fever, a desperate attempt to shortcut the brutal, slow labour of the frontier and find a quick road to prosperity. It was a dream that, for most, ended in an empty pocket and a bitter taste in the mouth. The most popular and iconic game of the Old West Saloon was not, as the movies would have you believe, poker. It was a game called faro. Today, it is almost completely forgotten, but in the 19th century, from the dusty camps of Arizona to the grand establishments of San Francisco, faro was king. It was fast, easy to learn, and had a carefully cultivated reputation for being one of the fairer games, a game where a player had a nearly even chance against the house. This reputation, of course, was often a lie. Imagine a table, often a specially made piece of furniture, covered in green felt. Painted on the felt is a layout showing the 13 cards of a single suit, usually spades, from the ace to the king. This is the faro board. The dealer, who works for the house, sits behind the table. He does not hold the deck in his hands. He uses a dealing box, a small, open-faced wooden or metal box designed to hold a single deck of cards and allow them to be slid out one at a time. This was supposed to prevent sleight of hand. You, the player, place your bet. You can bet on any of the 13 ranks on the layout. Let's say you put a $1 chip on the queen. You are betting that the queen will be the winning card on the next turn. The dealer then slides 2 cards from the box, face up. The first card he deals is the losing card. If the first card is a queen, you lose your $1. The second card he deals is the winning card. If the second card is a queen, you win, and the dealer pays you even money. If neither card is a queen, your bet stays on the board for the next turn. The dealer also uses a small abacus-like device called a case keeper to keep track of which cards have already been played, so players can see the odds on the remaining cards. It seems simple and honest, but faro was notoriously and ingeniously easy to rig. A skilled, crooked dealer could manipulate the game in a dozen different ways. The dealing box itself, meant to ensure honesty, could be gaffed, fitted with hidden springs, mirrors, or magnets that allowed the dealer to see the next card, or to deal a specific card from the middle of the deck instead of the top. The deck itself could be a stripper deck, with certain cards trimmed a fraction of an inch wider or narrower, allowing the dealer to manipulate them by feel. Or the cards could be marked with a tiny, almost invisible alteration on the back. A professional faro dealer, with his gaffed box and his cool demeanor, could fleece a table of naive cowboys of their entire trail drive earnings in under an hour, and they would walk away convinced they had just had a run of bad luck. The game was so associated with cheating that the phrase "to buck the tiger," which meant to play faro, the layout often featured a picture of a tiger, became synonymous with taking on a hopeless, losing proposition. Poker, of course, was also played, though it was often a slower, more serious and more dangerous game than faro. The version played was typically 5-card draw, not the Texas Hold'em you see today. Each player was dealt 5 cards face down. There was a round of betting. Then, each player who was still in the game could discard some of their cards and be dealt new ones from the deck. This was followed by a final, often tense round of betting, and then the showdown. Poker was seen as a game of skill and psychology, but it was just as rife with cheating as faro. The smoky, low-lit atmosphere of the saloon was a perfect environment for deception. Cards were commonly marked with a subtle bend, a small fingernail indentation, or a tiny ink spot. Professional gamblers, the sharps, often worked in teams, using a complex system of signals, a cough, a tap of the fingers, the way they held their cigar to communicate to their partners what was in their hands. They also used mechanical cheating devices called holdouts, which were complex contraptions of leather and wire strapped to their arms or legs, hidden under their clothes. These devices could secretly deliver a hidden ace from a sleeve into their hand at the critical moment. An accusation of cheating at the poker table was one of the most dangerous things you could do in a saloon. It was a direct, public attack on a man's honor, and in the rigid, unwritten code of the West, such an insult often had to be answered with violence. The tension around a high-stakes poker game was palpable. The men would be silent, their faces grim, unreadable masks. Their eyes would constantly flick from their own cards to the faces of their opponents. A single wrong move, a disputed pot, a careless word, could instantly transform the quiet, tense game into a scene of bloody, deadly violence. This is why many professional gamblers were also skilled gunmen. Their ability to defend themselves was a necessary part of their trade. There were other, simpler games as well. Monte, a Spanish card game, was essentially a shell game played with 3 cards, and it was almost always a crooked game run by a professional grifter to fleece newcomers. Simple dice games, like Hazard or Chuck-a-Luck, were popular for their speed. And in some of the larger, more disreputable establishments, you might find a roulette wheel or a keno game, both of which were almost always rigged to ensure a massive profit for the house. For the vast majority of men who played, gambling was a losing proposition. It was a tax on their optimism and their desperation. The cowboy who had just been paid after 3 months of grueling work, the miner who had a small poke of gold dust from a lucky find, the farmer who had sold his crop, they would come to the saloon looking for a bit of excitement, dreaming of turning their small stake into a fortune. And they would almost always walk away a few hours later, their pockets empty, their hopes dashed, having enriched no one but the saloon keeper and the cold-eyed professional gambler who was already looking for his next victim. The games of chance were another brutal, unforgiving feature of the frontier economy, a machine designed to separate a fool from his money. The soiled doves, the women of the saloon. In the overwhelmingly male world of the frontier town, a world of dirt, sweat, cheap whiskey, and raw, untempered masculinity, the presence of women was a powerful, complicated, and often tragic commodity. The saloon was the epicenter of this world, and the women who worked within its walls were both its central attraction and its most exploited resource. The enduring myth of the West, burnished by a century of film and television, gives us the prostitute with a heart of gold. She is a figure like Miss Kitty from Gunsmoke, beautiful, witty, fiercely independent, and possessed of a deep, unshakable integrity. She chooses her profession, maintains her dignity, commands the respect of the toughest men, and ultimately finds redemption in the arms of the hero. This is perhaps the most pernicious, insidious, and dishonest of all the saloon myths. The reality for the vast majority of the women who worked in and around these establishments was a life of economic bondage, relentless exploitation, rampant disease, constant violence, and a profound, soul-crushing despair. These women were known by a host of euphemistic, clinical, or crudely derogatory names: soiled doves, painted ladies, ladies of the line, calico queens, sporting women, or more directly hurdy-gurdy girls, and whores. Their presence was not an incidental feature of the saloon economy, it was fundamental to it. They were a necessary service for a population composed largely of young, single, and transient men. Cowboys, miners, soldiers, railroad workers, drifters starved for any form of female companionship, however fleeting or transactional. They were the engine of a massive commercial enterprise that separated these men from their wages. Why did a woman end up in this life? The romantic notion of the adventurous woman who chooses the life is a fiction. Rarely, if ever, was it a free choice. The path to the brothel or the saloon floor was almost always paved with dire economic desperation and a complete lack of viable alternatives. She might be a young widow whose husband was killed in a mining accident or on a cattle drive, left with no other way to support her children in a society with no social safety net. She might be a young woman from a poor farming family who was abandoned, cast out for a premarital pregnancy, or even sold by her own male relatives into a life of servitude. She might be a recent immigrant from Ireland, Germany, or China, who had arrived in a booming frontier town with no money, no connections, no knowledge of the language, and no other marketable skills. For a woman alone and without resources on the frontier, the options were stark and brutal. She could take up respectable work as a laundress, a seamstress, or a domestic servant. These jobs were characterized by back-breaking labor, incredibly long hours, and pay that was so low it barely staved off starvation. Or she could enter the world of prostitution, a life that was far more lucrative but infinitely more dangerous. The choice was often between a slow, grinding poverty in the light and a faster, more perilous existence in the shadows. For many, it was no choice at all. There was a distinct and cruel hierarchy within this world, a pecking order that determined a woman's income, her living conditions, and her chances of survival. At the very top were the courtesans or actresses who worked in the grander opera houses or theaters of the larger, more established cities like Denver, New Orleans, or San Francisco. These establishments were often a thin veneer for high-class brothels, catering to wealthy businessmen, politicians, and cattle barons. The women here were often beautiful, well-dressed, and skilled in conversation. They offered an illusion of refinement and romance, and commanded the highest prices. Below them were the women who worked in the established brothels, or bawdy houses, often run by a powerful madam. The madam, frequently a former prostitute herself, offered a degree of physical protection from the most violent customers and a steady stream of clients. In return, she took a huge percentage of the woman's earnings, often 50% or more. The madam also charged the women exorbitant prices for their room, board, and clothing, creating a system of debt peonage that was nearly impossible to escape. The women were prisoners of the madam's ledger book. Further down the ladder were the women who worked directly in the saloons. They might be employed as dance hall girls or hurdy-gurdy girls. A lonely cowboy or miner would buy a string of tickets from the bar, and each ticket would entitle him to one dance with a girl. The dance was often a clumsy, brief shuffle around a small, crowded floor to the tune of a tinny piano. The real purpose of the dance was for the woman to charm the man into buying her overpriced drinks. These drinks were usually just coloured water, flat soda, or weak tea, for which the saloon keeper would charge the price of a whiskey. The girl would receive a small commission on each drink she sold. Her primary business, however, the selling of her body, would be conducted in one of the small, shabby rooms, or cribs, located upstairs or in a dark alley behind the saloon. These cribs were tiny, often no bigger than a closet, containing only a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a bucket. The transactions were swift and anonymous, and at the very bottom of this hierarchy were the independent streetwalkers and the women who worked out of the lowest dives and hog ranches on the edge of town. These were the most desperate and vulnerable of all. They had no protection from a madam or a saloon owner, and were subject to the worst forms of violence and exploitation from customers, criminals, and lawmen alike. The life of a prostitute was one of constant, imminent risk. The threat of violence from drunken, aggressive, and often armed customers was a daily reality. A woman could be beaten, robbed, raped, or murdered with little or no recourse. The law, such as it was, offered her no protection. In fact, she was often a target for law enforcement. In many towns, prostitutes were subjected to a system of fines. They would be arrested for vagrancy or disturbing the peace, held in jail overnight, and forced to pay a heavy fine in the morning, which went directly into the town's coffers. It was a cynical form of informal taxation, a system designed to exploit her from every possible angle. But the greatest and most insidious threat was not violence, but disease. In a world without antibiotics, penicillin, or a true understanding of germ theory, venereal diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea were rampant, untreatable, and devastating. Syphilis, known as the Great Pox, was a terrifying multi-stage disease. In its primary and secondary stages, it caused sores and rashes, but if left untreated, it would enter a latent stage, only to re-emerge years later in its tertiary form. Tertiary syphilis could lead to blindness, paralysis, grotesque tumours, dementia, and a slow, agonizing death as the spirochete bacteria attacked the brain, the heart, and the spinal cord. Gonorrhea, while less deadly, could lead to sterility, painful pelvic inflammatory disease, and chronic joint inflammation that left a woman crippled with arthritis. The physical toll of these diseases, combined with the high risk of unwanted pregnancies and the extreme danger of illegal abortions, meant that the life expectancy of a frontier prostitute was incredibly short. Abortions were common, often performed by unskilled practitioners using crude instruments in unsanitary conditions, leading to hemorrhage, infection, and death. Many of these women were dead from disease, violence, or the complications of alcoholism before they reached the age of 30. To cope with the physical pain of their ailments, the emotional trauma of their nightly work, and the sheer crushing hopelessness of their situation, many of these women turned to the solace of drugs and alcohol. Alcoholism was an occupational hazard. They were expected to drink with customers, and many found in the bottle a necessary anesthetic for the soul. Addiction to laudanum, the readily available opium-based patent medicine, was rampant. Laudanum was cheap, legal, and promised a temporary escape from a life that was otherwise unbearable. It offered a dulling of the senses, a brief, dreamlike peace, a respite from the pain and the shame, but it only deepened the cycle of dependence and despair, leading to an addiction that was almost impossible to break, further binding them to their miserable existence. There were, of course, exceptions. A few shrewd, tough, and incredibly lucky women managed to survive and even prosper. Some saved their money with ferocious discipline, left the life, and managed to reinvent themselves, becoming respectable married women whose pasts were quietly forgotten. A very few, like the famous Madame Fanny Porter of San Antonio, who provided a safe house for outlaws like Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, became successful businesswomen in their own right, accumulating wealth and wielding a degree of power and influence in their communities. But these women were the rare, remarkable survivors of a brutal system that consumed and destroyed thousands of others. They were the exceptions that proved the horrifying rule. The soiled dove of the myth, with her witty banter, her glamorous clothes, her secret heart of gold, and her ultimate redemption, is a comfortable and deeply dishonest fiction. It is a fantasy created to sanitize a brutal reality. The true story of the women of the saloon was one of economic exploitation, of physical and emotional trauma, of rampant disease and crippling addiction. It was a life that was usually nasty, brutish, and short. These women were not a romantic sideshow to the great adventure of the West. They were some of its most tragic, forgotten, and disposable victims. The business and social hub. While the primary, undeniable business of the frontier saloon was the selling of alcohol and the temporary, often ruinous, escapism that came with it, to see it only as a den of vice is to miss its true and vital importance. In a new, raw, and unstructured frontier community, the saloon was often the first substantial building erected, and consequently the most important. It was the unofficial town hall, the post office, the newsroom, the courtroom, the employment office, the bank, and the central hub of all male social and economic life. It was a place of profound and necessary contradictions, and in many ways it was the messy, chaotic, and indispensable engine that made the town run. Let's consider a town in its infancy, a place like Deadwood in its first gold rush months, or a fledgling cattle town like Ogallala. It is little more than a collection of a dozen rough, unpainted buildings thrown up on the prairie, a muddy street separating two rows of false-fronted structures. Before a proper courthouse or town hall could be financed and built a process that could take years of civic development, the saloon was often the only large, public and heated indoor space in the entire community. As such, it became the default location for all public business, the de facto civic center. It was here, amidst the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and unwashed bodies, that the future of the town was forged. Political meetings were held at rough-hewn tables, where aspiring town fathers would debate incorporation, elect a temporary sheriff, or argue over the placement of a new well. It was here that a travelling circuit judge might set up a temporary courtroom, holding trials for horse thieves or other criminals right there amongst the curious drinkers and the spittoons. The bar itself might serve as the judge's bench, the jury box, a row of rickety chairs cleared for the occasion. It was here, after a crime had been committed, that a posse would be formed, with the saloon keeper often taking a leading role in rousing the citizenry to action. It was here that a uniformed military officer might come to recruit for the army, his patriotic appeals competing with the clink of glasses and the shuffle of cards. It was here that a cattle baron, his pockets flush with cash, would come to hire cowboys for a trail drive north to the railheads. or a mining foreman would seek labourers for a new silver strike. Important public announcements, a new ordinance, the results of an election, a warning of Indian troubles were often made from the steps of the most prominent saloon, the one place a crowd could be reliably gathered. The saloon was also the primary conduit for information, the organic, chaotic internet of its day. In an era before telephones and telegraphs reached these remote outposts, news travelled at the speed of a horse or a train. Official newspapers from back east might take weeks to arrive by stagecoach, by which time their contents were already stale history. The saloon was where news travelled by word of mouth, a much faster and more dynamic medium. The bartender, who stood in one place all day long, wiping glasses and listening to every conversation, was often the most well-informed person in town. He was the keeper of secrets, the spreader of gossip, the connector of people, and the central hub of the local information network. A newcomer to town, dusty and disoriented, would invariably make his first stop at the saloon. It was there he could find out about the price of land, the location of a new mining strike, the reputation of the local sheriff, or the availability of jobs. A traveller just passing through, a freight wagon driver, a stagecoach passenger, a drummer selling goods would be plied with drinks in exchange for news from the outside world. He would share stories of politics in Washington, business trends in Chicago, or troubles on the trail, and this information would ripple through the community within hours. Often, when a new newspaper did finally arrive, one of the few literate men in the room, perhaps the doctor or a failed lawyer, would be paid with a free drink to stand on a chair and read it aloud to the assembled crowd of illiterate or semi-literate patrons, who would listen with rapt attention, debating the news as it was revealed. If you wanted to know what was happening in your community, or in the nation, you went to the saloon. The saloon was also the undisputed centre of commerce, the frontier's equivalent of the stock exchange and the Chamber of Commerce combined. Many of the most important business deals of the West, transactions that shaped the economic destiny of the entire region, were negotiated and sealed not in a quiet, formal office, but over a bottle of whiskey at a sticky, scarred saloon table. The saloon was neutral ground, and the consumption of alcohol was a ritual that broke down inhibitions and fostered a sense of camaraderie, making deals easier to strike. A cattleman, having just driven his herd thousands of miles from Texas, might sell his entire stock, worth thousands of dollars in gold coin, to a buyer from a Chicago meatpacking company. A grizzled prospector, after months of lonely toil, might sell his mining claim for a fortune to an investor from San Francisco, often pouring his newfound wealth right back into the saloon's coffers in a single night of legendary celebration. A freight company owner might negotiate a lucrative contract to supply a nearby army fort with beef and flour. A land speculator, with a map spread out on the table, might sell plots of land to newly arrived settlers, his promises lubricated by cheap whiskey. The handshake and the shared drink were often as binding as any written contract, a man's word and his reputation being the only real collateral. For the many single, transient men who made up a large portion of the frontier population, the cowboys, the miners, the soldiers, the railroad labourers, the trappers, the saloon was a vital substitute for a home. It was a refuge from the profound loneliness and crushing isolation of their lives. For a man who lived in a crowded, lice-infested bunkhouse, or who had just spent months in the solitude of the mountains with only his horse for company, the saloon offered the basic human comforts he craved. It offered warmth from the bitter cold, light against the immense darkness of the prairie night, and, most importantly, human contact. It was a place to find companionship, to share stories, to play cards, to hear music, however poorly played on a tinny piano, and to feel a sense of belonging, however temporary. It was the living room, the clubhouse, and the sanctuary of the frontier male, a place where he could momentarily forget the hardships and dangers of his existence. The saloon was often the first and last stop for a traveller, the alpha and the omega of a frontier journey. The stagecoach line would frequently have its office in or right next to the town's main saloon. A weary, dust-covered traveller, after days of being bounced and jolted on a rough, uncomfortable stagecoach, would stumble out, stiff and sore, and walk directly into the saloon for his first drink, his first real meal, and the first news of the town. It was the gateway to the community. Of course, this central role also meant that the saloon was the epicenter of the town's most serious social problems. The alcoholism that destroyed so many lives, the gambling addiction that could wipe out a man's savings in a single night, the casual and brutal violence that erupted from drunken disputes, and the cynical exploitation of the soiled doves, all found their most potent and destructive expression within the saloon's four walls. This is why, as towns grew and became more civilized, a process that almost always coincided with the arrival of more women and families, the saloon became a cultural battleground. The respectable elements of town, particularly the women and the church leaders who formed the powerful and politically savvy temperance movement, saw the saloon as a source of all civic corruption, moral decay, and broken families. They saw it as the place where their husbands and sons wasted their wages, contracted diseases, and were drawn into a life of sin and violence. They campaigned vigorously and relentlessly to have the saloons closed or heavily regulated. The history of many frontier towns is the story of this long-running battle between the wet and dry factions, a battle over the very soul and future of the community. It was a struggle between the raw, masculine, transient culture of the frontier and the more stable, family-oriented and civilized culture that sought to replace it. So, the saloon was a place of profound and necessary contradictions. It was a place of community and of violent, atomizing conflict. It was a place of economic opportunity and of ruinous exploitation. It was a business office and a gambling den. It was a source of vital information and of destructive, malicious rumors. It was a sanctuary for the lonely and a trap for the addicted. It was, in short, a perfect, messy, dangerous, and indispensable reflection of the frontier society it served. A microcosm of all its hopes, its vices, its energies, and its sorrows. The anatomy of a saloon fight. Let's put it all together. You are in the saloon on a Saturday night. It is crowded, loud, and thick with smoke. You've had a couple of shots of the raw, burning whiskey, just enough to blur the edges of the hard world outside. The air is electric with a mixture of boisterous camaraderie and simmering tension. A fight is about to break out, and it will look nothing like the elegant, choreographed brawls of the movies. It will be a clumsy, pathetic, and terrifyingly real explosion of drunken violence. The trigger is not a noble offence. It is not a defence of a maiden's honour or a stand against a tyrannical cattle baron. It is something small, stupid, and fueled by cheap alcohol. A man stumbles and spills a 5-cent beer on another man's worn-out boots. An argument over a $2 pot in a poker game escalates, and one man accuses another of cheating. One man, in a drunken haze, imagines another man was looking at him the wrong way. It begins with a drunken, slurred insult, a challenge to a man's fragile sense of honour. The response is not a steely-eyed stare down across a silent room. It is more shouting, more posturing. Two men, their inhibitions erased by alcohol and their judgment clouded, stand chest to chest, yelling in each other's faces. Their voices are loud, their words are profane. Their friends might try to hold them back, urging them to calm down, or, just as likely, they might egg them on, eager for the violent entertainment. The general roar of the saloon quiets down slightly, a lull in the chaos as everyone turns to watch the drama unfold. The bartender narrows his eyes, his hand moving slowly to rest on the edge of the bar, near the shotgun he keeps there. Then comes the first act of physical violence. It is not a clean, heroic punch to the jaw from a handsome hero. It is a clumsy, desperate shove. One man pushes the other, who stumbles backward into a table, sending glasses crashing to the floor. Or one man, in a sudden fit of rage, grabs the heavy, thick glass beer mug from the bar and smashes it over the other's head. The sound of the breaking glass is sharp and ugly, followed by a grunt of pain. Now, It is a brawl. The fight is not a choreographed ballet of fisticuffs, with men trading well-aimed blows. It is a chaotic, messy, close-quarters struggle. The men grapple. They slip on the sawdust and spit-covered floor. They wrestle each other to the ground, overturning tables and chairs. They are not following any Marquis of Queensberry rules. They are kicking, they are biting, they are gouging at each other's eyes. Other men, friends of the combatants, might jump in, and it becomes a swirling, grunting mass of flailing limbs. The weapons are improvised. A man might grab a wooden chair and bring it crashing down on his opponent's back. The chair splinters. He is left with a jagged chair leg, a crude but effective club. A whiskey bottle is broken against the edge of the bar, its jagged neck becoming a slashing weapon. A bowie knife, a large, heavy knife carried by many frontiersmen for skinning game and general utility, might be drawn from a sheath. The glint of the long steel blade in the smoky lamplight changes the dynamic instantly. This is no longer a brawl for dominance, it is now a lethal encounter. And then, someone, usually the man who is losing the physical fight, in an act of final desperation, draws a pistol. He fumbles in his waistband or his coat pocket, his hands clumsy with whiskey and adrenaline. He pulls out the heavy Colt revolver. He has to pull the long, stiff hammer back with his thumb. In his panic, he might fire before he has even fully aimed, the gun going off while it is still pointed at the floor. The sound of the shot inside the enclosed space of the saloon is not the satisfying bang of the movies. It is a deafening, concussive roar that physically shakes the room, rattles the glasses on the shelves, and leaves your ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. Immediately, the room is filled with a massive cloud of thick, white, sulphurous black powder smoke. It stings your eyes and chokes your lungs. It is impossible to see more than a few feet in front of you. The first shot likely misses its intended target. The heavy lead bullet might plough into the wooden bar, into the ceiling, sending down a shower of splinters, or, tragically, into an innocent bystander on the other side of the room. Panic erupts. The other patrons, who had been watching the fight as a form of entertainment, now dive for cover, overturning tables, creating a barricade of broken furniture. Now the other man has his gun out. He fires back, aiming blindly into the smoke cloud where he thinks his opponent is. More smoke, more deafening noise. The room is now a scene of pure, terrifying chaos. The men are not skilled marksmen taking careful aim. They are frightened, angry and drunk, firing frantically into a swirling fog, guided only by the orange muzzle flashes of each other's guns. The fight ends in a matter of seconds. It ends when one man is hit and falls to the floor, groaning. Or it ends when both men are out of their 5 allotted bullets. Or it ends when the bartender, having had enough of the destruction of his property, finally reaches under the bar for his sawed-off shotgun, the true peacemaker of the saloon, and unleashes a blast of buckshot into the ceiling, the sheer, overwhelming roar of the shotgun enough to shock everyone into silence. When the thick, acrid smoke finally begins to clear, the scene is one of carnage and confusion. Someone is lying on the floor, groaning, bleeding from a ragged, ugly wound. The room reeks of burnt black powder, spilled liquor, and fear. The piano player has not been playing a dramatic, suspenseful score through all of this. He, like everyone else with any sense, was the first one to dive under his piano for cover. This was the reality of a saloon fight. It was not a duel of honor. It was a clumsy, pathetic, and terrifyingly dangerous explosion of drunken violence, where the participants were as likely to shoot themselves or an innocent bystander as they were to hit their target. It was the brutal, logical endpoint of a room full of armed, intoxicated, and desperate men.